Hello and welcome to my channel. Here I tell interesting stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
In the shadowed heart of ancient Greece, where mountains pierced the clouds and the sea whispered secrets to the shore, there lived three sisters known as the Gorgons. They were not like other women. Their skin shimmered like polished bronze, their teeth gleamed sharp as daggers, and instead of hair, living serpents writhed upon their heads, hissing with every turn. But among them, Medusa was different. She was the youngest, the fairest, with eyes like storm-tossed emeralds and a voice that could soothe the wildest waves. Mortals who glimpsed her from afar spoke of her beauty in hushed tones, calling her the Bright One, a rare light in the Gorgon's grim lineage. Medusa's story begins not in rage or vengeance, but in love, a forbidden flame that would ignite the gods' jealousy. Her parents were the ancient sea deities Phorcys and Ceto, creatures of foam and fury born from the primordial chaos. They ruled a desolate island far from the golden fields of Olympus, a place of jagged rocks and endless mist where no ship dared anchor. Here the sisters, Medusa, Stheno, and Euryale, guarded sacred relics of the deep. Pearls that held the tears of drowned sailors, shells that echoed the screams of the abyss. Medusa, though fierce by blood, dreamed of more. At night, when her snakes slumbered, she would wander the cliffs, gazing toward the mainland where humans built cities and told tales of heroic gods. "Why must we hide?" she whispered to the wind. "Why are we monsters when our hearts beat like theirs?" Her sisters laughed at such notions. Stheno, the eldest, was all claws and cunning, her laugh a thunderclap. Euryale, wild and unyielding, preferred the hunt, her serpents ever hungry for prey. But Medusa yearned for connection, for a world beyond isolation. One fateful evening, as the sun bled red into the sea, a temple maiden arrived on their shores. She was a runaway from Athena's sacred shrine in Athens, fleeing the goddess's unyielding demands. Her name was Calliope, slender and pale, with hair like spun gold. Exhausted and shipwrecked, she collapsed at the Gorgon's cave. Medusa found her first. Pity stirred in her heart, a rare emotion for one born of monsters. She carried the girl inside, silencing her snakes with a gentle touch. "Who are you?" Calliope gasped, her eyes wide but unafraid. Medusa's beauty, even veiled by shadow, held no terror for the pure of heart. "I am Medusa, daughter of the deep. Rest here. No harm will come." Calliope stayed, and in her stories of the world beyond, Medusa found wonder. She spoke of bustling markets, festivals under starlit skies, and temples where gods walked among men. But most captivating were tales of Poseidon, the earthshaker, lord of the seas, handsome, tempestuous, with eyes like crashing waves and a laugh that rivaled storms. "He visits the shores," Calliope said, "seeking beauty wherever it hides." Medusa's heart quickened. For the first time, she felt the pull of desire, a longing that made her snakes restless even in sleep. Days turned to weeks. Calliope taught her to weave garlands from cliffside flowers, and Medusa shared the island's hidden lore. But whispers of danger followed. Athena's priestesses sought the runaway, and rumors spread of a monster isle where maidens vanished. One storm-ravaged night, Poseidon himself washed ashore, or so it seemed. His chariot of hippocampi had overturned in the gale, or that was his tale. Tall and bronzed, with trident in hand and salt-kissed hair, he strode into their cave like he owned the tides. The sisters bowed. Even monsters knew the god's power. But Medusa's gaze lingered. His eyes met hers, and in that instant, the world shifted. "You are no ordinary creature," Poseidon murmured, his voice a rumble of waves. Your beauty rivals the dawn. Stheno and Uriel hissed warnings, sensing the god's hunger, but Medusa, entranced, led him deeper into the shadows. What happened next was a whirlwind of passion. In the temple ruins on their island, a crumbling shrine to Athena, long forgotten by mortals, Poseidon claimed her. Their union was fierce, born of storm and sea, with waves crashing outside as witnesses. Medusa surrendered fully, her snakes coiling in ecstasy, believing this was love, a bridge to the divine world she craved. But gods do not love as mortals do. Dawn brought Poseidon's departure, his laughter echoing as he vanished into the foam. Medusa lay fulfilled, yet hollow, touching her belly where a spark of life stirred. Calliope, witness to it all, wept. "He has used you, sister," Athena will know. And know she did. Athena, virgin goddess of wisdom and war, felt the desecration like a slap. Her temple, even in ruins, was sacred ground. Jealousy burned in her gray eyes, jealousy not of Medusa's beauty, but of the passion she could never claim. How dare a mortal-born creature sully my domain with such filth? Athena thundered from Olympus. She descended in a flash of owl wings, confronting Medusa amid the temple stones. The Gorgon knelt, unafraid at first. "Goddess, it was no fault of mine. He came to me." Athena's laugh was ice. "Lies. You seduced him, monster. Now bear the mark of your shame." With a wave of her aegis shield, she unleashed her curse. Medusa screamed as her emerald eyes turned to burning gold, her serpents multiplying into a writhing crown, her skin hardening to bronze scales. Worst of all, her gaze became death itself. Anyone who met it turned to stone, frozen in eternal terror. "Your sisters remain untouched," Athena sneered. "They did not betray me. But you will be hunted, feared, alone." Medusa fled to the island's depths, her heart shattering. Stheno and Uriel raged but could not lift the curse. Calliope vanished in the night, her fate unknown. Pregnant and transformed, Medusa wandered the caves, whispering to her unborn children, winged horses and a golden warrior, born of divine seed. Pegasus burst forth first, soaring into the stars, followed by Chrysaor, gleaming sword in hand. They fled, sensing their mother's doom. Word spread. Heroes sought the Gorgon for glory. Medusa, once radiant, became a shadow, her cave a tomb of stone statues. Soldiers, sailors, fools who came too close. Each victim's face captured their final horror, a gallery of regret. Nights brought dreams of Poseidon's touch, now twisted into nightmare. "Why me?" she wept, her voice echoing unanswered. Yet in isolation, a quiet rage grew. Medusa pondered her fate. Was she truly the villain? The gods played with mortals like toys, then punished the broken pieces. Her gaze, once inviting, now protected her, a weapon born of injustice. Hunters came, a boastful warrior from Crete, turned to marble mid-swing, a sly thief from Sparta, petrified, clutching his dagger. Years blurred into decades, Medusa's cave filled with trophies, her legend growing. Sailors spoke of the stone witch of the West, a demon whose eyes ended empires. But deep within, the woman lingered, dreaming of redemption, of a hero who might see beyond the monster. One day, a new challenger approached, Perseus, son of Zeus and Danae, golden-haired and bold, armed with divine gifts, a helm of Hades for invisibility, winged sandals from Hermes, a sickle from Hephaestus, and Athena's mirrored shield. He sought Medusa's head for King Polydectes, who coveted his mother. The gods favored him, whispering directions through oracles. Medusa sensed him coming. The air hummed with fate. "Another fool," she murmured, coils tightening. But something felt different. Perseus moved with caution, not bravado. As he entered her lair, statues loomed like sentinels. Medusa rose, eyes blazing. "Turn back, boy. My gaze claims all." Perseus averted his eyes, shield raised. "I seek only your head, Gorgon. No more." Their battle began, not of swords, but wits. Medusa lunged, serpents striking. Perseus dodged, glimpsing her reflection. She was magnificent, terrible. For the first time, he hesitated. Was this glory or murder? Perseus stood amidst the silence of the cave, his breath hitching as he gripped the handle of the mirrored shield. Before him, the stone statues stood in frozen agony, a testament to the tragedy of the Gorgon's existence. He was a hero, yes, a son of the lightning lord, but in this dim, salt-choked air, he felt like nothing more than an intruder in a tomb of sorrow. Medusa moved with a feline grace, her serpents hissing a rhythmic, unsettling melody that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. "Why do you come, son of Zeus?" she asked, her voice not the screech of a monster, but a low, melodic tremor that carried the weight of centuries. She did not strike immediately. She circled him, her bronze scales clicking against the damp stone floor. "Do you seek the glory of the poets? Do you want to take my head back to your king to show him what a brave man you are?" Perseus kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished surface of the shield. He saw her there, distorted and shimmering, a woman with the face of an angel and the crown of a nightmare. "I seek only to protect my mother," he replied, his voice strained. "Polydectes demands your head. If I do not bring it, he will destroy her." Medusa let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. The gods command, and mortals jump. They tear each other apart for the whims of those on Olympus and call it heroism. "Look at me, boy. Look at what they turned me into." "I cannot look at you," Perseus said, taking a wary step backward. "If I look, I die." "You are already dead, in a way," she hissed, her snakes rising in a chorus of warnings. "You are just a puppet with golden hair. Do you even know who I was before? I was a creature of the sea once. I walked upon the sand and felt the sun on my skin. I was not always this thing that curdles blood." Perseus felt a pang of confusion. The oracles had told him of a beast, a terror that must be purged from the world to restore balance. But the being in front of him spoke with the grief of someone who had lost everything. He shifted his weight, his winged sandals fluttering nervously. "You have taken many lives here," he countered, trying to steel his resolve. "These men, these travelers, they were not all monsters." "They were hunters," Medusa shouted, the sound echoing off the cavern walls, causing the statues to tremble. "They came with swords of iron and hearts of greed, looking to carve their names into my flesh. I gave them peace. I gave them eternity. When you are stone, you no longer feel the betrayal of the gods. You no longer fear the coming of the night." She lunged then, a sudden, blinding blur of movement. Perseus barely had time to raise his shield. He felt the rush of wind as her tail swept past, knocking a cluster of stalactites from the ceiling. He scrambled away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was fast, but she was ancient, her reflexes honed by decades of survival in the dark. "You speak of betrayal," Perseus gasped, ducking under a strike from her sickle-shaped claws. "Athena was once my patron. I do not understand why she would curse you so cruelly if you were innocent." "Innocence is a luxury of the dead," Medusa cried, her golden eyes flashing even through the reflection on his shield. She was jealous, jealous of a beauty she could not command, of a passion that existed outside her cold, sterile halls. She turned me into a mirror of her own bitterness, a creature to be reviled so that she might remain the pure, untouchable queen of wisdom. Perseus felt the weight of his task becoming unbearable. He had come here expecting a confrontation with evil, but he found instead a mirror of a much deeper, more universal pain. He remembered the tales of the gods, their petty squabbles, their disregard for the lives they shaped and discarded. Was he any different? Was he not also being used? A piece on a cosmic board, moving toward an end he had no hand in choosing? He found his footing near a shallow pool of water, the ground slick with algae. Medusa was slowing down, her movements heavy with the exhaustion of one who had been fighting her own existence for an eternity. She stopped, her chest heaving, the snakes on her head drooping. "Strike, then," she whispered, her voice softening into a plea. "If you must finish the story, do it. I am tired, Perseus. Tired of the cold, tired of the silence, tired of being the monster in the dark that everyone tells stories about." Perseus gripped the sickle of Hephaestus, his knuckles white. The steel was cold, ancient, and sharp enough to cut through the fabric of reality itself. He saw her reflection, a woman, not a demon, standing before him. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. If he killed her, he would be doing exactly what the gods wanted. He would be the hero who silenced the truth. But if he didn't, he would fail his mother. "I cannot let you go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I will not do it with malice." Medusa closed her eyes. "There is no malice in mercy, son of Zeus, only in the gods." As he stepped forward, the shadows of the cave seemed to dance, the statues seeming to watch with heavy stone eyes. Perseus drew the sickle back. The air grew still, the only sound the faint rhythmic hissing of the serpents, which had now quieted into a low, mournful drone. He moved not with the speed of a warrior, but with the solemnity of a priest performing a final rite. The strike was swift, precise, and over in an instant. As the deed was done, a strange, ethereal light filled the cavern, casting long, wavering shadows against the stone. Medusa fell, and as she touched the ground, her form began to dissipate into a soft, golden mist. The curse that had bound her to this island, to this form, was unraveling. The serpents turned to dust, scattering like autumn leaves in a gale. Perseus stood alone, the weight of the head now secured in his satchel, but his hands felt strangely light. He looked at the shield, now reflecting only the empty, peaceful cavern. He had won, but the victory tasted of ash. The gods had their trophy, but he had lost his certainty. He walked out of the cave, the sunlight of the Aegean morning blinding him after so many hours in the dark. Below him, the sea sparkled, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in the shadows. He had begun his journey as a boy seeking to prove his worth, but as he turned his gaze toward the horizon, he knew he would never be that boy again. The path away from the cave was not the path of a conqueror, but the stumbling gait of a man who had glimpsed the gears of the cosmos and found them rusted. Perseus walked along the rugged shoreline, the weight of the satchel at his side pulling at his shoulder, yet it felt as if it were pulling at his very soul. Every step against the damp sand reminded him of the sound of Medusa's voice, a voice that had not asked for blood, but for understanding. The waves of the Aegean Sea rolled in, rhythmic and indifferent, masking the echoes of his own conscience. He reached a small cove where he had left his boat, a modest craft of cedar and linen. The sun was climbing high, casting a harsh, unblinking glare across the water. Perseus sat on the sand, his winged sandals folded neatly beside him. He stared at the horizon, where the blue of the sea met the pale, hazy sky. He had expected to feel a surge of triumph, the kind the poets sang about in the courts of kings. He had expected the thrill of the hunt to be replaced by the satisfaction of a duty discharged. Instead, he felt only a profound, hollow silence. He thought of his mother, Danae. Was she truly safe? Or was the safety he had bought with a woman's life merely another thread in a tapestry woven by the gods to suit their own entertainment? The question gnawed at him. He pulled the satchel closer, his hand hovering over the clasp. He did not open it. He did not want to see what lay within. He knew the stone, the finality of it. He knew that if he looked, he would see the face of a woman who had dared to dream, now frozen in the stillness of a manufactured fate. As he sat, a seagull circled overhead, its cry a sharp, lonely sound that cut through the doldrums of the afternoon. He watched it dive, a flash of white against the deep azure of the water. Nature was cruel in its own way, predator and prey, survival and death, but it was honest. It did not have the malice of the immortals. It did not create monsters just to watch them suffer for the sake of a story. Perseus began to understand why Medusa had sought the isolation of the dark, the light of the world above, governed by the cold gaze of Olympus, was a place where stories were written in the blood of the innocent. "Is this the legacy of a hero?" he whispered to the salt-heavy air. There was no answer, only the slap of water against the hull of his boat. He realized then that the gods were not his allies. They were the architects of his burden. By sending him to the island, they had not just sought a trophy. They had sought to test his capacity for cruelty. They wanted to see if the blood of Zeus could commit a murder for the sake of convenience and call it virtue. He had fulfilled their request, but in the doing, he had discovered the cost of their favor. It was not courage that they demanded, but compliance. Perseus rose, his legs stiff. He needed to wash the dust of the cave from his skin. He waded into the shallows, the cool water biting into his ankles, then his knees. He submerged his hands, rubbing away the grime. The sea was clear, showing the smooth, multicolored pebbles on the bottom. For a moment, he watched the small fish darting between the stones, their lives simple, unburdened by the expectations of prophecy or the reach of divine hands. He envied them. He turned back to the shore, deciding it was time to leave. He had a kingdom to return to, a mother to free, and a truth that he would carry like a hidden wound. As he climbed into his boat, he noticed something resting on the sand where he had been sitting. It was a single, iridescent scale, a fragment of the bronze skin Medusa had once worn. It shimmered in the sun, catching the light in a way that seemed to defy the natural world. He picked it up. It felt warm, as if it still held a flicker of the life that had been extinguished. He placed the scale in his tunic, close to his heart. It was a reminder, a weight to balance the one in the satchel. If he was to be a hero, he would be a hero who remembered the humanity of his foes. He would not be the blunt instrument of divine vengeance. He set the sail, the fabric catching the breeze, and watched the jagged cliffs of the island grow smaller until they were nothing more than a smudge of charcoal against the bright blue canvas of the world. As the boat cut through the waves, he began to sing. It was not a song of battle or glory. It was a song he had heard his mother humming when he was a child, a melody of the earth, of the harvest, of the simple joys of mortal life. It was a song that felt completely out of place in the epic cycle of heroes, and for that reason, it felt like the most honest thing he had ever done. He saw a ship in the distance, its sails emblazoned with the crest of a nearby port. It was a merchant vessel, its deck piled high with amphorae of wine and grain. He felt a sudden, desperate need to be among them, to hear the mundane talk of prices and ports, the trivial worries of people who did not know the names of the gods or the shape of monsters. He steered his boat toward them, not as a demigod, but as a traveler seeking a port. "Ho, ship!" he called out, his voice carrying over the waves. The sailors on the merchant vessel turned, shading their eyes. They hailed him, their voices rough and welcoming. "Where are you bound, lad?" "I am bound for anywhere but where I have been," Perseus replied. They laughed, a hearty, salt-crusted sound. As he drew alongside, he saw their faces, weathered by the sun, lined by years of labor. They were beautiful in their own mortal way. He tied his boat to the railing and climbed aboard, leaving the satchel on the seat of his craft. He could not bring it with him. He would hide it, bury it beneath the floorboards, or perhaps cast it into the deep, where the currents would carry it to a place where it could no longer tell its story. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the captain remarked, offering him a cup of watered wine. Perseus took the cup, feeling the heat of the ceramic against his palm. "No, Captain, just the truth. And the truth is a hard thing to look at." He looked back toward the island one last time. The sun was setting now, turning the sea into a vast, molten mirror. He thought of Medusa, of her eyes that had seen the cruelty of the gods, and he realized that she had been the only one on that island who had truly been awake. The rest of them, the heroes, the hunters, the kings, were all sleepwalking through a tragedy they helped to create. He drank the wine. It tasted of grapes, of soil, and of the sun. It was the taste of the world he was going to fight to keep, not for the gods, but for the humans who were small enough to love and big enough to suffer. The boat sailed on, carrying him away from the island and toward an uncertain future. He was a hero, perhaps, but as the stars began to poke through the veil of the twilight, he knew that the most important part of his journey was not the task he had finished, but the person he had become in the silence that followed. He slept then, for the first time in many days, and in his dreams he saw a woman walking on the sand, her hair the color of the sun, and for the first time she was not afraid. Perseus sailed through the night with the merchant crew, and the sea around him was calm, almost too calm, as if the world had paused to listen to the things he could not say. The stars spread across the sky like scattered silver dust, and their light touched the water in thin, trembling lines. No storm rose against him, no god thundered from above. That silence felt worse than anger. It felt like judgment. He sat alone near the bow of the ship, wrapped in a rough wool cloak, with one hand resting over the satchel hidden beneath the deckboards. He had not opened it. He had not looked. Yet he could feel it there like a sleeping heart. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he thought he heard the faint sound of snakes, or perhaps only the memory of them. He could not tell anymore. The line between memory and guilt had begun to blur. The captain had given him a place among the crew, and no one asked too many questions. Sailors were like that. They knew better than most men that every traveler carried a secret, and some secrets were heavier than stones. The crew spoke of weather, trade routes, distant harbors, and the price of grain. Their words were ordinary and practical, and Perseus found comfort in that. Ordinary things now felt holy to him: a rope in a sailor's hand, bread shared before dawn, a cup of watered wine, the creak of wood beneath feet. These small things had the shape of peace. At dawn, the ship entered the waters near Seriphos. The island rose from the sea in dark green slopes and pale cliffs, familiar now in a way that made his chest tighten. This was the place where his mother had been kept under the power of King Polydectes, the place where his journey had begun. Perseus stood at the rail and watched the shore grow larger. The land seemed unchanged, but he knew he was not the same man who had left it. He disembarked at the harbor and thanked the merchant captain with a bow. The sailors nodded to him with the quiet respect given to men who had survived something unseen. Then he walked alone along the harbor road, past fishing nets spread to dry in the sun, past whitewashed houses, past children chasing each other between baskets of lemons and figs. The island looked peaceful, but Perseus knew that beneath its sunlit face, old cruelty still lived. He climbed the hill to his mother's house. Danae stood in the doorway before he even reached it, as if her heart had heard him before her ears did. She was older now, and the years had touched her with silver at the temples and soft lines around the eyes, but her face was still the face Perseus remembered from childhood, strong, gentle, and full of a courage no king had ever managed to break. For a moment they simply stared at each other. Then Danae ran to him and held him as if she would never let go. Perseus dropped the satchel from his shoulder and wrapped his arms around her. All at once, all the weight he had carried since the island of the Gorgon seemed to pour into the earth beneath them. He had imagined this moment while crossing seas and cliffs and shadows. He had imagined triumph, joy, relief. Yet what he felt was more fragile than that. He felt the ache of survival. "My son," Danae whispered, "my brave, foolish son." Perseus laughed weakly, and the sound almost broke into tears. "I came back." "Yes," she said, touching his face with trembling hands. "You came back, changed." She knew. Mothers always knew. Inside the house, the air was cool and shaded. The walls were simple, the floor swept clean, and a small lamp burned near the table. Everything looked smaller than Perseus remembered. Or perhaps he was simply larger now, carrying the shape of the world upon his shoulders. Danae prepared water and bread, then sat across from him and studied his face while he ate. She did not rush him. She did not ask first about the monster. She asked whether he was hurt, whether he had slept, whether he had been kind to himself on the road home. Those questions almost undid him. At last, when the room grew quiet and the sun lowered outside the window, Perseus told her everything. Not in the language of poets, not in the grand voice of a victor, but in the simple voice of a son speaking to his mother in the evening light. He told her of the cave, the stone statues, the mirrored shield, the voice of Medusa, the way she had spoken not like a beast, but like someone who had been abandoned by the world. He told her of the strike, the mist, the silence after. Danae listened without interruption. Her hands rested folded in her lap, but her eyes grew wet as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The gods give tasks as if they are gifts, but gifts should bring life, not shame." Perseus lowered his head. "I thought I was saving you." "You did save me," she said softly, "but that does not mean the road was just." Her words stayed with him. That night, Perseus could not sleep. He lay on a mat near the window while the wind moved through the shutters like a slow breath. Danae slept in the next room. The house was still. The island beyond it was still. Yet Perseus felt something shifting in the darkness, something deeper than weather or dream. It was the sense that the story was not finished. He rose before dawn and stepped outside. The first light of morning was pale and clean. The sea below the hill shimmered with silver light. From where he stood, he could see the harbor, the fishing boats, the thin line of smoke rising from the kitchens of the village. Life continued. It always continued. That was the strange mercy of the world. Grief did not stop the tide. A tragedy could happen, and still the bread had to be baked, the nets mended, the water carried, the children called home. Perseus walked down toward the shore alone. There, near a pile of black stones washed smooth by the sea, he found something he had not expected. A gull had left it there, or the tide had carried it in, or perhaps it had been waiting for him all along. It was a fragment of dark green glass, polished by the waves until it looked almost like a jewel. He picked it up and turned it in his hand. It reflected the sky. It reflected his face. It reflected the world as broken and beautiful at the same time. He thought then of Medusa's cave, of the mirror shield, of the way he had refused to look directly at her. He had seen only her reflection, a divided truth, a safe truth, and yet even that was enough to change him. A voice behind him said, "You were gone long enough." He turned. It was the old fisherman who lived near the harbor road, a man with a bent back, a weathered face, and hands rough as rope. Perseus had known him since boyhood, though they had rarely spoken. The man carried a basket of nets over one shoulder. "I was somewhere else," Perseus said. The fisherman grunted. "Most men are when they return." Perseus gave a tired smile. "And what do they do when they come back?" The old man set the basket down and looked out at the sea. "They either become better men or bitter ones. Depends on what they brought home with them." Perseus looked at the glass in his hand. "I brought home a wound." "Then treat it well," the fisherman said. "Some wounds teach, others rot." That advice remained with Perseus too. Days passed, then weeks. The island returned to its rhythm, but Perseus did not. He began helping the fishermen repair their boats. He carried water for neighbors, helped clear debris from the storm path near the village, and spent long hours with his mother, learning to speak like a man who was no longer chasing greatness. People noticed the change in him. Some thought it made him quieter. Some said he looked older. A few called him noble, but Perseus knew he was simply becoming real. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sea with fire, he stood on the hill behind the house and looked toward the horizon. Far off, the water seemed endless. Somewhere beyond it were other islands, other cities, other stories. He wondered how many heroes were walking into darkness at that same moment, believing themselves chosen, believing the gods would reward them for obedience. He wondered how many monsters had once been innocent before the world gave them a face to wear. He touched the place over his heart, where he kept the bronze scale he had taken from the shore near Medusa's island. It was still there, warm from his skin, small, silent. A reminder. Danae came to stand beside him. "You think of her," she said. He did not deny it. "Yes." "Then remember her truth, not only her death." Perseus nodded slowly. "I will try." Danae looked at him with a mother's sorrow and a mother's pride. That is all any of us can do. The gods did not appear. No thunder came. No owl flew overhead with a message from Athena. No wave rose to claim him. Yet Perseus felt that he had entered a different kind of trial, one without speeches, one without glory, one without song. The hardest test was to live after violence and not let violence define the rest of his life. Years later, people would speak of Perseus as a great hero. They would tell the old story in the halls of kings and in the mouths of travelers. They would say he had slain the Gorgon, rescued his mother, and won honor from the gods. They would leave out the silence. They would leave out the grief. They would leave out Medusa's voice in the cave, and the way he had walked away carrying not only a trophy, but a question. Did he become the man the gods wanted? Perhaps. But he also became something else. He became a witness, and that mattered. For when he told the story to those who could hear beneath the surface of it, he did not speak of monsters as if they were born from evil alone. He spoke of power, fear, injustice, and the way a life can be turned into a legend before it has finished bleeding. He spoke of the cost of obedience. He spoke of mercy and of the terrible weight of being chosen by forces greater than yourself. As for Medusa, her name did not disappear. It traveled farther than the names of the kings who cursed her. Children whispered it at night. Sailors feared it. Poets reshaped it. And somewhere in the memory of the sea, beneath the gulls and waves and changing tides, she remained what she had always been. Not only a monster, but a sorrow the world had chosen to call one. Perseus stood many times after that on the shore of Seriphos and watched the moon rise over the water. Each time he remembered the cave. Each time he remembered the gaze he had refused to meet. And each time he understood a little more that the truth was not as clean as the stories told by kings. The sea never answered him, but it did not need to. It only moved. And in that movement, Perseus learned to keep going. Perseus had expected the story to end when he returned home, but stories rarely end where men imagine they will. They continue to move through the lives of others, changing shape each time they are spoken. In the years that followed, he learned that a single act can become many different things depending on who tells it. To one man, it is courage. To another, it is cruelty. To the gods, it is entertainment. To the people who suffer under its shadow, it is memory. He stayed on Seriphos for a time, helping Danae, helping the fishermen, helping anyone who needed strong hands and a steady gaze. The island no longer felt like a prison. It had become a place of reckoning, then healing. Yet even there, in the quiet simplicity of daily work, the past remained close. At night, when the wind moved across the walls of the house and the sea breathed below the hill, Perseus would wake and think he heard the faint hiss of serpents in the dark. He never told Danae this. She already knew enough of what haunted him. There were moments when he wondered whether Medusa's death had truly ended her story. The gods, after all, were not generous with closure. A life could be cut down, but its image could live forever. That thought disturbed him more than the sword ever had. He began to understand that a legend is not a tomb. It is a mirror, and whatever is placed before it will be reflected, distorted, and preserved. One morning, not long after the harvest, a stranger arrived on the island. He wore no crown, no armor, no sign of power. He was a traveler with a dust-covered cloak and a staff worn smooth by years of use. He asked for Perseus by name. The villagers, cautious but polite, directed him to the hill house. When Perseus opened the door, he found the stranger standing in the sunlight with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but deeply knowing. "You are harder to find than your story," the man said. Perseus studied him. "And you are?" "Only someone who has listened." The answer was vague enough to be either wisdom or evasiveness. Perseus stepped aside and invited him in. Danae offered bread and water, and the stranger accepted both without haste. Once seated, he told them that he had traveled across several islands and through several courts where people spoke of Perseus in different ways. Some praised him as a divine conqueror. Some called him a bold son of Zeus. Others, more cautious, said he had taken the head of a monster, but returned with the face of a man haunted by the deed. Perseus looked down at the table. They speak too much. They speak too little, the stranger corrected. The difference matters. Danae watched the exchange quietly. The stranger continued, there are those who are beginning to say the Gorgon was no beast at all. They say she was punished for a crime she did not commit. They say a goddess turned beauty into terror and then sent a hero to complete the disgrace. Perseus said nothing. The stranger leaned forward. Do you know what becomes dangerous, Perseus? Not only lies. Truth that arrives too late can become a kind of lie as well. Perseus looked up sharply. The stranger's expression remained calm. You can still decide what your part of the story means. The gods will keep their version. Kings will keep theirs. But yours, if you are brave enough, can be different. Danae spoke then, her voice gentle but firm. And what would that version be? The stranger smiled faintly, the one where a man learns to see the cost of being useful to power. No one answered immediately. The room filled with the sound of wind against the shutters. Outside, a gull cried once, then fell silent. At last, Perseus asked, Why tell me this? The stranger stood and walked to the doorway, where sunlight cut a pale line across the floor. Because legends do not belong only to those who kill. They belong also to those who remember. He paused, then added, and because forgetting is how cruelty repeats itself. When he left, he did not say where he was going. By evening, he had vanished from the island as quietly as a shadow crossing water. Perseus did not forget the conversation. It followed him for months. He began to tell the story differently when asked about the Gorgon. Not always, and not to everyone. Some people were not ready for a truth that complicated their admiration. But to those who could listen, he spoke of Medusa as a woman transformed by divine punishment, not simply a creature destroyed by heroism. He spoke of the cave as a place of sorrow. He spoke of the statues as evidence not of victory, but of the fear the world had used to trap her there. These words made some people uncomfortable. Others fell silent. A few objected, saying he was weakening the glory of the tale. Perseus would answer only that glory was cheap when purchased with another person's life. One winter, while rain lashed the cliffs and the sea turned slate gray, Danae fell ill. The healers came with herbs and warm cloths. Perseus sat beside her bed through the long nights, holding her hand as if by strength alone he might keep her anchored to the world. She was old by then, and her body had grown tired of carrying the years. Her breath became shallow, then slower, then weaker still. On the final night she woke as though from a dream. Perseus, she whispered. He leaned close. I am here. She smiled faintly. You became the man I hoped you would be. He shook his head. I failed you in many ways. No, she said. You suffered. That is not the same thing. Tears gathered in his eyes. I could not save everyone. No man can, she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only peace. But you can refuse to become what hurt you. Those were among her last words. When morning came, Danae was gone. Perseus buried her on the hill overlooking the sea, where the wind was kind and the view stretched far enough to make grief feel less confined. The villagers came to mourn her, for she had been beloved among them for her patience and grace. Perseus stood beside the grave in silence, his cloak pulled tight against the cold. He felt as if the last soft thing in his life had finally passed into the earth. After the burial, he remained on the hill until sunset, The sky burned orange and gold, then slowly darkened into violet. He placed a small offering at the grave, a bowl of water, a bit of bread, and the bronze scale he had carried for so long. He laid it on the soil where the wind could touch it. He did not know whether Medusa's memory could reach that place, or whether anything at all survived death in a form that mattered. But he wanted the world to know that he had not forgotten her. Years later, when men and women of other islands came to Seriphos, they would ask about the hero who slew the Gorgon. Some expected a tale of triumph. Others wanted terror. Instead, many found a man older than the songs, quieter than the statues, and unwilling to speak of himself as if he were the center of the world. One afternoon, a child asked him, was she really a monster? Perseus looked out across the water before answering. No, he said, she was someone the world decided to fear. The child frowned, trying to understand. But did she turn people to stone? Yes. Then why was she not a monster? Perseus crouched beside the child so that they were eye to eye. Because a wound can be dangerous without being evil. Because fear can make weapons out of people who were not born as weapons. Because sometimes the thing everyone fears is only the thing everyone has refused to understand. The child thought about this, then asked the question Perseus had feared for years. Did you kill her because you had to? He did not answer at once. The wind moved between them. The sea rolled in slow and silver beyond the rocks. At the time, he said at last, I thought I did. That is the hardest part. The child was quiet. Then, in the innocent way of children, asked, would you do it again? Perseus looked toward the horizon. In that far line between sky and sea, he saw the shape of all the things he could never take back. He thought of the gods. He thought of Medusa's voice. He thought of Danae. He thought of the stranger who had taught him that stories can become chains unless someone dares to loosen them. I do not know, he said honestly. That honesty, more than any boast, was the truest mark of his life. As the years passed, the island changed. Houses were repaired, boats were built and lost. Children grew into adults. Old men died. New stories arrived on the tide. But Perseus remained not as a figure of perfection, but as a man who had learned the limits of heroism. He was no longer the young son racing toward destiny. He was a witness to what destiny had done. And Medusa, though dead, never disappeared. Her image survived in carvings, in whispering songs, in the warnings mothers gave their children, in the dreams of sailors crossing moonlit water. But slowly, in some places, something else began to survive too. Pity, then respect, then understanding. It was not enough to undo the harm. Nothing ever is. But it was something. And sometimes something is how justice begins when justice itself has been delayed too long. Perseus sometimes wondered whether Medusa had known in her final moments that her story would outlive the gods' version of it. He hoped she had. He hoped that somewhere in the silence beyond the world, she had found the peace that was denied to her in life. He hoped that the children of her strange and terrible legacy, Pegasus and Chrysaor, had carried some memory of her tenderness into the sky and the earth. On the last evening of his life, many years later, Perseus walked once more to the shore where the sea met the stone. He was old now, his hair silver, his steps slow, but his eyes were still sharp. He stood there as the sun sank and the waves gathered light around their edges like fire in glass. The world was quiet. He had spent a lifetime carrying the shape of a terrible choice, yet he had also spent that life trying to make the shape less cruel in the telling. That was his final task. He did not pray to Zeus. He did not call for Athena. He did not ask for the gods' blessing or forgiveness. Instead, he stood in the salt wind and listened to the sea. It answered him with its endless motion, a sound older than victory, older than shame, older than legend. And at last, he understood what had taken him so many years to learn. The greatest heroes are not those who never break. They are those who remain human after breaking. And so the story of Medusa lived on, not only as the tale of a monster slain, but as the story of a woman who was transformed by power. A hero who discovered the cost of obedience, and a world that needed time to learn the difference between fear and truth. The sea kept moving, the stars came out, and the legend, no longer simple, became more honest than before. For a long time, there was only the sea. It kept moving under the sun and the moon, under winter clouds and summer heat, under the watch of stars that had seen the rise and fall of kings. It had watched heroes come and go. It had watched monsters become myths. It had watched men call their fear justice and their greed destiny. And still it moved, as if to say that the world could endure far more than the people living in it believed. Perseus stood on the shore and watched it too. By then his steps were slower, his shoulders slightly bent, and his face carried the marks of many seasons. But the eyes of age are sometimes sharper than the eyes of youth. He saw more now, not less. He saw how quickly stories were polished until they shone like marble and lost the rough truth underneath. He saw how people preferred clear enemies and clean endings. He saw how mercy made them uneasy because it blurred the lines they used to feel safe. He had spent many years trying to live as a man instead of a symbol. That had not been easy. A symbol is light to carry at first. Men admire it. They praise it. They hold it up in festivals and songs. But a symbol has no flesh. It does not age. It does not bleed. It does not wake in the night with questions it cannot answer. A man does all of those things, and Perseus had become increasingly aware that this was not a weakness. It was the truest thing about him. One spring morning, when the air smelled of salt and wild thyme, he returned to the cave path in his mind. Not in body, he would never go there again, but in memory. He had not thought of Medusa's cave in some time, or so he believed. Yet memories have a way of waiting, like stones beneath still water. He remembered the wet floor, the statues, the silence, the sound of her voice changing when she spoke of the gods. He remembered the moment before the strike, when he had seen not a beast, but a woman who had been made into a warning. He had told the story many times since then. Each time he noticed a different detail. Each time the world tilted a little. That was how truth behaved. It did not arrive all at once. It came in layers. The villagers now called him Old Hero, though never to his face. Children still approached him with curiosity. Travelers still came with questions. Some asked for the old tale of the Gorgon, the one with the head and the shield and the flight back through the sea. Others asked about the stranger who had once visited him and spoken so strangely of memory and cruelty. Perseus never gave the same answer twice, but he always tried to keep one thing steady. He would not let Medusa become only a weapon in the mouths of others. That effort became his quiet work. There came a season when a group of young singers arrived on the island. They were full of energy and idealism, and they wished to gather old tales from people who had lived long enough to remember them clearly. One of them, a girl with braided hair and a sharp, thoughtful face, asked Perseus if he would speak to them about the Gorgon. He led them to the cliff above the harbor, where the sea opened wide before them. The sky was pale, and gulls drifted in the distance like scraps of torn paper. The singers sat in a loose circle while Perseus stood or knelt beside them, depending on what the wind allowed. At first they asked him for the familiar details: the cave, the shield, the curse, the flight, the return. He gave them those things without embellishment. Then the girl with the braids asked, what was she like before the end? The others fell silent. This was not the question they expected. Perseus looked out over the sea. Afraid, he said after a time. Lonely, angry, proud, grieving. More human than anyone wanted to admit. One of the boys frowned. But she killed people. Yes, Perseus said, and many people would have killed her even if she had never harmed them. That is the part the songs prefer to forget. The braids girl leaned forward. So what should we call her? Perseus was quiet for a long moment. The wind lifted the edge of his cloak. Somewhere below, the waves struck the rocks with a sound like distant drums. Call her Medusa, he said at last. Not only the monster, the woman too. The singers wrote that down as if it were a sacred instruction. That evening, after they had left, Perseus remained on the cliff alone. The sunset spread across the water in layers of red, gold, and violet. It reminded him of blood when he was younger. Now it reminded him of endings that were not truly endings. He thought of all the names that had clung to him through the years. Son of Zeus, slayer of the Gorgon, rescuer, hero, favored one. He had carried them because he had no choice, but they had never felt fully his. What he had chosen, however, was what mattered now. He had chosen to remember. He had chosen to speak carefully. He had chosen not to let power write the final shape of Medusa's story without resistance. That was not enough to fix the past. Nothing was, but it was enough to prevent its complete erasure. In the months that followed, Perseus found himself growing weaker. Not ill exactly, but changed by time in a way that no man can avoid. His hands trembled slightly in the morning. His hearing sharpened in some ways and dulled in others. His dreams became more frequent and stranger. In them, he often saw the island cave not as it had been, but as it might have been in another world. Medusa still alive, walking the shore without fear, the sea calm around her feet. He never woke from those dreams in peace, but neither did he wake in despair. One night, in the deepest part of sleep, he dreamed that he was walking through the cave again. The floor was dry, the statues were gone. The air smelled not of salt and stone, but of flowers after rain. At the far end of the chamber stood Medusa, not as the monster the world had made, but as the woman he had only briefly been allowed to see. Her snakes were quiet. Her gaze did not petrify. Her face was sad, but not broken. You came too late, she said. Perseus in the dream bowed his head. Yes. She looked at him for a long time. Then what did you do with the lateness? He did not understand the question, and she seemed to know that he would not. So she answered it for him. You carried it, she said. That is what men do when they cannot change what happened. Some carry it into hatred, some into silence, some into wisdom. You chose the hardest one. He woke before dawn with tears on his face. After that, he changed the way he spoke even more. He began to tell the children, the singers, and the travelers that the world is full of stories where the wrong person is punished because they are easier to punish than the ones in power. He told them that heroism without thought can become another form of obedience. He told them that the gods in stories are often less noble than the mortals who suffer under them. Some listened, some did not, but listening was enough for a seed to remain. Years passed, and the old fisherman who had once given Perseus a lesson about wounds died quietly in his sleep. Perseus attended the burial and laid a wreath of seagrass near the grave. The old man's sons thanked him for coming. They said their father had always believed Perseus would one day understand the lesson he had spoken. Perseus smiled sadly at that. Some lessons, he thought, cost too much to learn. By then, the island had changed its stories of him. No longer was he only the bright-handed son of Zeus who had conquered terror. He was also the man who had returned with a more difficult truth. People did not always like that version, but over time, they grew used to it. And once people grow used to a harder truth, they become less willing to accept comfortable lies. That was the beginning of a small but real change. A generation later, the singers who had once sat on the cliff began performing a new song. It still included the cave, the shield, the flight, and the return. But it also included Medusa's voice. It included her grief. It included the idea that beauty could be broken by power and then blamed for the shape of the damage. Some listeners objected at first. Others were moved. A few wept. The song spread. It did not erase the old version. Myths never disappear that cleanly. But it placed another version beside it, and now there were two truths for people to hold. The first was easier. The second was harder. The second was closer to the flesh of what had happened. Perseus heard the song once in the village square while the sun was going down. He stood at the edge of the crowd, hidden under a plain cloak, and listened as the singer gave Medusa a name that sounded almost like prayer. He did not speak. He did not reveal himself. He simply stayed until the end, and then walked away. That night he sat alone by the sea and let the waves speak for him. He was old enough now to know that a life is measured not by how loudly it is praised, but by what it leaves behind in the hearts of others. If he had changed at all, perhaps it was because he had learned that the point of surviving a tragedy is not to wear it as a medal. The point is to become less willing to cause one. That understanding softened him, but not into weakness, into care. He took care with words. He took care with memory. He took care with silence too, when silence was the more honest form of respect. There were still nights when he grieved Medusa as though she had only just died. There were other nights when he felt angry at the world for forcing him to become the instrument of her death. But the anger no longer ruled him. It lived beside sorrow now, not above it. That was a kind of peace. On the final day of his life, Perseus woke before sunrise and knew at once that something had changed. Not in pain, not in alarm, in stillness. The body knows its own horizon long before the mind can accept it. He dressed slowly and walked down to the shore, where the first light was touching the water. Danae's grave rested on the hill above him. The old fisherman's grave lay farther inland. Medusa's cave was far beyond the sea, but in memory it was near. He stood with his feet in the wet sand and watched the tide come in, and he felt no fear. Around him the world was waking. Fishermen called to one another. A child laughed somewhere behind a wall. Smoke rose from kitchens. The ordinary life he had once cherished continued around him like a current. That, perhaps, was the final mercy. The world did not stop to admire one man's ending. It simply made room for it. Perseus closed his eyes. He did not ask the gods for anything. He did not ask Medusa for forgiveness. He did not ask Danae to appear. He asked only that his memory remain honest. And then, as the sun rose over the sea, he understood that honesty itself could be an offering. When he died, there were no thunderclaps, no divine proclamations, no golden armors descending from the sky. only the tide and the light and the wind. But in the years that followed, those who told his story carefully remembered that he had changed. They remembered that he had refused, in the end, to be only what the gods had made him into. They remembered that he had tried to speak for the woman whose life had been twisted into a warning. And because he remembered her, she did not vanish. Medusa lived on in the sea-facing songs, in the quiet doubts of children, in the warnings against cruelty, in the question people began to ask when they heard a hero praised too quickly. What was the cost of his victory? That question was Perseus's true inheritance, not the head, not the fame, not the treasure of a dead monster. The question. And questions once planted can outlive empires. The sea kept moving. The stars kept turning. The old island kept its cliffs, its harbor, its bread ovens, and its winter rain. And somewhere in the deep memory of the world, Medusa remained not as a thing defeated, but as a wound that had finally been seen. That was enough to make the legend different, not kinder, not simpler, but truer. In the years after Perseus's death, the islanders continued to speak his name, but they spoke it more carefully than before. The old songs still existed, the ones that praised the hero with bright voices and clean endings. Yet beside those songs, softer ones began to grow. They were not as easy to sing. They did not move with the same certainty. They paused in places where the old versions rushed ahead. They asked what had been lost, not only what had been won, and because of that, they stayed. Stories are like seeds. Some fall on stone and vanish. Some are carried away by wind. Some find soil where no one expected it. The story of Medusa found such soil. At first it began in whispers, a mother telling her child that not every monster is born a monster. An old sailor saying that some islands are cursed because men bring their own cruelty with them. A singer changing one line in a familiar tale so that the audience would fall silent for a moment and wonder whether the villain had ever truly been a villain at all. These were small changes, easy to miss. But a world is altered by small changes more than by great speeches. Far from Seriphos, in cities built of white stone and bronze doors, scholars began to argue over the old accounts. Some insisted that the gods must always be obeyed, because the stories of the gods were the stories of order itself. Others began to say that obedience is not the same thing as justice. They pointed to Medusa. They pointed to Athena. They pointed to Perseus. They asked whether a hero can remain pure if the hand that guides him is never questioned. The arguments lasted years. They filled courts, temple steps, and shaded courtyards where the old men spoke of honor and the young listened with bright, uneasy eyes. No one agreed, but no one could forget. And forgetting, once interrupted, never returns to its former strength. One spring, a traveling poet arrived at Seriphos carrying a scroll full of revisions. He had heard the newer version of the tale and wanted to hear whether the old hero himself approved of it. By then, many people had asked similar questions, but few dared ask so directly. The poet was bold in the way only the young can be bold, when they still believe truth is a door that opens once you knock. He found the house on the hill and asked for the son of Danae. The woman who answered the door was not Danae, for Danae had long since been laid to rest. It was a neighbor, an elderly widow with kindly eyes. She pointed him toward the shore, where Perseus, now bent and silver-haired, was walking alone with a staff in his hand. The poet caught up with him near the rocks where the tide had left a line of foam. "You are Perseus?" the poet asked. The old man looked at him. "I used to be called that." The poet smiled awkwardly. "Then perhaps you are the man I sought." Perseus said nothing for a moment. He had learned that the young often speak in forms that are half respect, half performance. He did not mind. He had once been that age too. "What do you want?" he asked. The poet unrolled his scroll. "Your story. The true one, if you still know it." Perseus looked back toward the sea. "There is no single true one." "Then the truest one?" That, at least, was a better question. Perseus sat on a low stone near the shore and let the boy sit beside him. For a long while he said nothing. The wind lifted the edge of the scroll. The waves moved steadily, as if time itself had become visible. At last he said, "When I was young, I thought a life was measured by the great things it could do. Slay a monster, rescue a mother, win a kingdom, bring home a trophy. That is how boys think when they are made hungry for glory." The poet listened without blinking. "But the older I became," Perseus continued, "the more I understood that the greatest thing a man may do is not always the loudest. Sometimes it is to refuse to lie about what happened. Sometimes it is to speak of a dead woman without turning her into a decoration. Sometimes it is to admit that the hero did not understand the full shape of his own act until much later." The poet lowered his eyes to the scroll. "Then I should not write only of your victory." "No," Perseus said, "write of the cost." The poet hesitated. "Will people like that?" Perseus gave a dry, tired smile. "No, but they may need it." The poet left before sunset, carrying the version of the tale that would trouble and enlarge the minds of those who heard it. Perseus watched him go and felt no triumph, only relief. A truth spoken was never the same as a truth hidden. That summer, a storm struck the island. It was a hard storm, the kind that drove goats into caves and tore the roofs from old sheds. The sea rose high and dark, and fishermen worked late into the night to secure their boats. Perseus, though aged, still insisted on helping. He tied ropes, lifted beams, and moved with the stubborn grace of a man who no longer thought himself important, but still believed himself useful. When the storm passed, the village found that one of the outer shrines had been damaged. Not the great temple, only a small one set near the cliffs, where women often left flowers and shell offerings for those they had lost. The roof had partially collapsed, and inside the wall paintings had been cracked by falling stone. The villagers gathered to repair it, and Perseus joined them. As they worked, one of the women, a potter with rough hands and a straight back, began to speak of Medusa. She said that her daughter had recently asked whether the Gorgon had ever been happy. The question had surprised her. She had not known how to answer, so she had come to the shrine to think. The others listened. Then a fisherman's wife said that her grandmother had always believed Medusa was a warning against the cruelty of the gods, not against women. Then a younger man said that perhaps the old stories had frightened him more because he had never liked the idea of people being punished for something they did not choose. The shrine, half damaged and smelling of wet stone, became a place of testimony. One after another, people spoke not of the myth they had inherited, but of the meaning they believed it should now carry. Perseus stood in silence and listened to them all. When at last the work was done, the potter asked him, "What do you think, old hero?" Perseus wiped the dust from his hands. "I think," he said slowly, "that when a story survives by becoming more honest, it grows stronger." The woman nodded, as if she had known he would say something like that. By autumn, the repaired shrine had become a place where people left offerings not only for the lost, but for those who had suffered unjustly. Some left flowers, some left coins, some left nothing but a moment of silence. The name Medusa, once spoken with fear, began to be spoken with sorrow, and then, in some mouths, with respect. This was not because the world had become good. The world had not. It was because enough people had finally understood that fear should not be mistaken for proof. Perseus felt the change most keenly when he walked alone at dusk. He would hear fragments of conversation from houses and courtyards, the woman in the cave, the goddess who cursed her, the hero who saw too late. None of these phrases would have existed in the old telling. None of them removed the wound, but they made room around it. And room, in the end, is what healing begins with. As for Medusa herself, she became many things in the years that followed. To children, she was still a frightening figure in the dark, but now the fear often came mixed with sympathy. To some women, she became a symbol of the rage of those wronged by powers that would never admit fault. To sailors, she was a warning not only against recklessness, but against blindness. To poets, she became a shape that could hold both terror and grief at once. And to Perseus, she remained the woman he had seen too late. He never stopped carrying her memory. In the final winter of his life, when the cold wind rolled down from the hills and the sea looked like hammered iron, Perseus asked the villagers to bring him to the cliff above the harbor. He could no longer walk there alone. His legs were weak now, and he needed 2 sons of fishermen to help him with each step. They did so without complaint. He had become for them a figure not of distant glory, but of patience, age, and witness. They left him there with a cloak around his shoulders and a stool beneath him. The sky was clear. The water below shone pale in the winter sun. The gulls hung motionless in the wind. Perseus looked out across the sea and let his thoughts move where they would. He thought of Danae. He thought of the old fisherman. He thought of the stranger who had once told him that legends belong also to those who remember. He thought of Medusa and the cave and the long road home. He thought of the many versions of himself that had existed across the years: son, hero, liar, witness, old man. And he thought, perhaps for the first time without pain, that all of them had been real. A child approached him then, a little girl with a wool cap pulled low over her ears. She held a small wreath of dried grasses in her hands. "My mother says you knew the Gorgon," she said. Perseus nodded. The child looked at him with solemn curiosity. "Was she scary?" "Yes," he answered. "Was she sad?" "Yes." "Was she bad?" Perseus studied her small face, the careful way she waited for the answer, as if it might change something in the world. "No," he said softly. "She was hurt." The girl considered this. Then, with the simple courage children have, she held out the wreath. "Then this is for her." Perseus took it. His hands trembled slightly. He thanked her, and she ran back to her mother without looking behind her. He held the wreath in his lap as the sun lowered. When the villagers came to fetch him later, they found him sitting very still, the little circle of grass resting over his heart. He asked them to take him home, and they did. He died 3 nights later in his sleep. No thunder came, no god descended, no divine voice proclaimed his fate. The sea remained the sea. The moon moved across the sky. The household lamp burned low and then lower still. Dawn came, as dawn always comes. The island buried him beside Danae, on the hill above the water. The singers came, the fishermen came, the children came, and among the offerings left on the grave were flowers, shells, bread, a bronze scale long kept by the family, and a small wreath of dried grass placed by the little girl who had asked the question no poet had dared ask for years. In time, the tale of Perseus and Medusa spread far beyond Seriphos. It crossed seas and generations. It was sung by those who sought glory, and by those who sought truth, and by those who did not yet know the difference. Some retellings lost the sorrow. Some restored it. Some reduced Medusa to a warning. Some lifted her into the shape of a survivor. Some turned Perseus into a shining hero again. Others made him a man burdened by regret, but no retelling could fully erase what had been added. The cave was no longer only a place of victory. It had become a place of consequence. And Medusa, once silenced by terror, had found a new voice in the memory of those willing to hear her story whole. This is how legends change. Not all at once, not by decree, but by the slow courage of people who refuse to let the easiest version remain the only one. And so the old world, which had once, after Perseus was buried, the island changed in ways that were almost impossible to see from one season to the next. The roads were still the same, the harbor still filled with boats at dawn. The goats still wandered the cliffs. The wind still came down from the hills with salt in it. Yet something deeper had shifted. The people of Seriphos had inherited not just a hero's grave, but a question that would not leave them alone. What is a monster? What is a hero? And who decides the answer? At first, these questions were asked only in whispers. An old woman kneading bread might speak them to herself while staring out the window. A fisherman mending a net might mutter them when the sea was too quiet. Children, who are often the first to sense a change in the stories adults tell, began to ask why some names were spoken with fear and others with pride, when both might belong to people who had suffered. The question spread. It reached the singers first. They were the ones who carried stories from village to village, from island to island, from generation to generation. They understood that a tale is never fixed in one shape for long. A story can be polished until it glows, or handled so carelessly that it cracks. The best singers knew that both danger and mercy lived in the way a tale was told. They had heard the newer versions of Medusa's story and found them unsettling, because they made the old certainty impossible. But they also found them honest. And honesty, once it enters a song, changes the rhythm. So the singers began to adapt. They did not erase the ancient version completely. That would have been foolish. The old world does not surrender its myths easily. But they wove in new threads. They sang of Medusa not only as a terrifying gaze, but as a woman altered by divine cruelty. They sang of Perseus not only as a conqueror, but as a man who returned carrying regret. They sang of Danae not as a passive mother waiting for rescue, but as a steady force of endurance. And in doing so, they gave the audience something rarer than victory: complexity. At first, this complexity made people uneasy. Many preferred clean lines. They liked their heroes bright and their monsters dark. It was easier that way. But over time, the repeated exposure to a more complicated truth made it familiar. Familiarity is not the same as acceptance, but it is the road to it. By then, the little girl who had left the wreath on Perseus's grave had grown older. Her name was Thalia, and she had inherited her mother's practical hands and her father's habit of asking inconvenient questions. She became one of the singers herself, not because she had the most beautiful voice, though she did, but because she remembered being a child and feeling the weight of the old stories without understanding why they hurt her. When she was 17, she performed the new version of the Medusa tale in the square at the center of the island. The crowd was mixed. Fishermen, merchants, mothers, children, a few skeptical elders, and several travelers from beyond the island who had heard rumors that Seriphos now sang strange songs about its greatest hero. Thalia began with the old opening: the sea, the island, the daughters of the deep, the cave, the cursed face, the mirrored shield, the hero's approach. The audience settled into the familiar shape of the tale. Then she changed it. She gave Medusa a voice, not a loud voice, not a dramatic one, a human voice, a voice that wondered why beauty had become a crime, a voice that asked whether the gods punished what they desired and called it justice, a voice that trembled in the cave when she spoke to Perseus not as an enemy, but as one abandoned creature speaking to another. The crowd listened in silence so deep that even the market sounds around the square seemed to recede. When Thalia finished, no one clapped at once. The silence lasted longer than applause would have. Then slowly a woman in the back began to weep. After that, others followed. Not because the story was sad, though it was, but because they had recognized something in it that had been missing from their own understanding of the world. That evening, the old priest who had once complained that Thalia made myths too soft came to her and said, "You have changed the tale." She answered, "No, I have only let it remember more of itself." The priest had no reply to that, and so the newer version spread, not as an argument, not as a decree, as a song. This is how the world changes most often, not by force, but by repetition. Years passed, then decades. The graves on the hill were tended by children who had never met Perseus, but had heard of him as if he were both a man and a lesson. Danae's grave gathered wildflowers in spring. Perseus's grave received small stones from sailors who believed in old customs. Sometimes people left polished shells or bits of blue glass, or even a handwritten line of verse folded into the soil. And once, after a storm, someone found a small statue of a woman with snakes carved into her hair, left there in the rain without explanation. No one removed it. That was another quiet shift. In the past, the island would have feared such a figure. Now it allowed it to remain. The statue was not worshipped. It was simply there, standing at the edge of memory. And perhaps that was enough. Far away, in cities that had never seen Seriphos, scholars began to discuss the old story of Medusa with unusual seriousness. Some argued that she represented the consequences of divine injustice. Others insisted that the gods must remain above human judgment. But even those who defended the old order had to speak more carefully, because the newer interpretations had become part of the public mind. That was the real change. Not that everyone agreed, but that disagreement had become possible. Perseus's grave became a place where people came to think, not only to honor him, but to test the shape of the old story against the new one. Some came with admiration, some with doubt, some with anger, some with grief. It was said that when the wind moved through the olive trees around the hill, it sounded like a crowd speaking in many voices at once. Thalia liked to sit there in the evenings. She had known the old hero in his final years, though only in his diminished human form. She had seen how age had softened the edges of his legend. She had heard the tremor in his voice when he spoke of Medusa. She had been a child when she left the wreath on his lap, but that memory had remained with her as a compass. She had grown into the understanding that stories can either seal a wound under polish or open it to the air, where healing may begin. She chose the second path. One night after a performance, she sat alone beside the graves. The sky was clear, and the moon made silver lines on the path below. The sea was calm. She had been singing the final verse of the new version, the one that ended not in triumph, but in witness. in it, Medusa's name was spoken gently, without fear. Perseus's sorrow was not hidden. Danae's endurance was praised. The gods were not excused. Thaleia rested her chin in her hands and looked at the stones. "I wonder," she said aloud, "whether either of them would recognize this story." The wind moved through the grass. No voice answered, but she had not expected one. Still, she smiled a little. Perhaps that is the point. What she did not know, and what no one could know, was that stories have their own form of afterlife. They move from mouth to mouth, yes, but also from generation to generation, from fear to curiosity, from admiration to reflection. A story that begins as a weapon can, in time, become a lantern. Not always, not automatically, but sometimes. Medusa's story became such a lantern. There were villages across the coast where mothers now told their children not to mock the strange or fear the broken too quickly. There were sailors who, before setting out, would pour a little wine to the sea and whisper Medusa's name not as a curse, but as a warning against arrogance. There were young women who heard the tale and felt for the first time that their anger was not a defect, but a form of truth. There were old men who listened and understood too late that they had once called cruelty order, because it was easier than changing. And there were poets, always poets. Some wrote Medusa as a sorrowful queen, others as a victim of divine pride, others as a symbol of the violence society commits against beauty it cannot control. A few tried to return her to monstrosity, but even they could not do so without including the wound. The wound was now too visible, too large, too human. As for Perseus, his image changed too. The golden hero became the tired witness. The slayer became the man who learned that power can be inherited without being understood. The son of Zeus became, in some retellings, less a victor than a caution. Not because he was evil, but because he was human enough to be used by forces greater than his own understanding. That was the difficult gift of the later versions. They did not make him smaller. They made the world larger. More painful, yes, but also more honest. If a legend is a house, then the old version had only one room, a bright one filled with trophies and clear boundaries. The newer version added a corridor, then a shadowed chamber, then a window looking out onto the sea where the supposed monster had once stood alone. It did not remove the first room. It simply refused to let the first room be the whole house. And so the story continued to grow. 100 years after Perseus's death, a traveler wrote in his notes that on Seriphos there was a grave visited by children. 100 years after that, another traveler wrote that the grave belonged to a man who had slain the Gorgon, but later came to understand that every victory has a body beneath it. 100 years after that, a song was recorded in which Medusa was described not as the monster, but as the woman the gods made into a monster, and the hero was made to call by another name. With each retelling, the story became a little less obedient and a little more alive. This is the strange mercy of time. It does not heal everything, but it can make room for new meanings. Thaleia grew old. She had children and grandchildren. She sang less often, but when she did, her voice still held the old cliffside wind in it. People asked her whether she believed Medusa had truly existed in the way the songs described. She would answer, "Does it matter? The wound is real either way." That answer frustrated some listeners and comforted others. It was probably the most honest answer she had. Near the end of her life, Thaleia asked to be buried not far from Perseus and Danae, though not beside them. She wanted to remain within sight of the hill, but not under the weight of the hero's name. Her grave was simple, no grand marker, only a stone with a line she had chosen herself. She remembered more than one ending. It was said that on the night of her burial, the sea was unusually calm. The moon hung full over Seriphos, and the water below reflected it so perfectly that the horizon almost disappeared. Some who saw it later said it looked as if the sky had opened a second path beneath it. Others said that was nonsense. But perhaps the sea had only done what it always does. It had held the reflection of whatever was given to it. And what was given to it, at last, was not a single story, but many. The story of Medusa no longer belonged only to the cave. It belonged to the people who refused to forget the woman inside the monster. It belonged to the hero who learned too late, but not too little. It belonged to the island that changed by slowly learning how to speak differently. It belonged to every person who had ever been punished for the shape of their pain. And because of that, it was no longer merely an old myth. It had become a memory that could keep teaching. The sea still moved, the stars still watched, and somewhere beyond the reach of names, beyond the habit of fear, beyond the old habit of calling cruelty by holy words, Medusa's last memory remained alive in the mouths of those who were brave enough to tell the truth more than once. Long after the island had forgotten the sound of Perseus's footsteps, the sea remained the last witness. It had touched his boat, his hands, his grief, and the small bronze scale he once carried against his heart. It had carried away the dust of his age and the final breath of his name. It had also carried memory. Not memory in the human sense, not the careful remembering of a mother or the deliberate telling of a poet, but something older and more patient. The sea remembered shape. It remembered touch. It remembered the outline of what had once stood at the edge of the world and had been made into story. And so, even after the island's graves were tended by other hands, even after the singers of Thalia's time had faded into silence, one thing remained: the reflection. It appeared first in the old stories told near the shoreline. Children would stand at the water's edge and swear that when the light was just right, they could see a face beneath the waves. Not a monster's face, not the face of terror. A woman's face, pale and sorrowful, looking up through the moving mirror of the sea. Adults dismiss these tales as imagination, but adults often call imagination the things they are not ready to understand. Then, years later, a fisherman claimed he saw the same thing. He had gone out before dawn, when the tide was low and the sky still held the last dark of night. As he pulled in his nets, he noticed the water was unusually still in one shallow stretch near the rocks. There, in the flat, dark surface, he saw a face looking back at him. He thought first it was his own reflection, but then he saw the eyes. They were not his. They were older, sadder, and full of a calm that made his hands tremble. He let go of the net and crossed himself in the old island manner. By the time he looked again, the face was gone. He told no one at first, but by midday he had told 3 people, and by sunset the whole harbor knew. Some laughed, some shivered. Some said the sea had merely played tricks on a tired man. Yet the fisherman never changed his story, and neither did the details. He never claimed to have seen claws or snakes, wings or fangs. Only a woman's face, appearing not to frighten, but to ask to be remembered. That detail spread. Soon the story changed shape. It was no longer said that the face in the water belonged to a ghost. Some said it was Medusa herself. Some said it was a memory left behind by the gods, unable to sink. Others said it was the sea's way of holding what the world had rejected. No one agreed. But everyone repeated the story a little differently, and that is how a legend gains strength. One summer, a young woman from a mainland city arrived on Seriphos. She was a student of old tales and had come because she had heard that the island now treated Medusa's story differently. She walked the harbor, the hill, the graves, and the old shrine by the cliffs. She listened to the islanders speak. She listened more than she spoke, which already made her wiser than many scholars. Her name was Ione. She came from a city where the old myths were still taught in rigid forms. There, Medusa was always a villain, Perseus always a victor, the gods always distant and correct. But Ione had begun to suspect that stories told too neatly were hiding something. She had read enough to know that the ancient world was not made of clean lines. It was made of fear, desire, power, sorrow, and the stories people used to survive all of them. At the hill grave, she met an old woman who was arranging flowers near Danae's stone. "Do you come for the hero?" the woman asked. "I come for the whole story," Ione answered. The old woman smiled with the faint approval of someone who has been waiting many years to hear a sensible reply. "Then sit," she said. Ione sat. For a while they said nothing. The wind moved through the grass. Below them the sea flashed in the sunlight. At last the woman pointed to the grave nearest the edge of the hill. "That one was Perseus," she said. "People used to leave polished coins there. Now they leave flowers too. It took some time." "And the other?" Ione asked. "The other was Danae. She was not forgotten, but she was often spoken of as if she were only waiting. That was not fair. She waited. Yes, but waiting is not a small thing." Ione nodded. She had come hoping to learn myths, but she found herself learning memory. The old woman continued. "And Medusa? People used to fear her so much they forgot she had a life before the fear. They called her a warning because it was easier than calling her a wound." Ione looked down toward the water. "Was she real?" The woman shrugged. "More real than many things the world praises." That answer followed Ione for the rest of her stay. She spent weeks on the island. She copied songs. She spoke to fishermen and potters. She listened to children recite the newer version of the tale. She asked about the statue left in the shrine after the storm. She asked about the stories of the reflection in the sea. Some islanders smiled at her curiosity. Others tested her patience, but all of them gave her pieces. By the time she left, she had begun to see that Medusa's story was no longer merely a myth about gods and monsters. It had become a lens through which the island could examine power, shame, and the habit of calling pain fate. Back on the mainland, Ione began to teach differently, not to replace the old forms entirely. She knew better than that. Old myths have roots deep enough to survive many attempts at correction. But she began to teach that a story has more than one moral if the people inside it are more than one thing. She taught that Medusa could be both dangerous and wronged, that Perseus could be both brave and complicit, that Athena could be wise and cruel, that the gods of stories were not always fit to be called moral simply because they were powerful. Some of her students resisted, some argued, a few were angered, especially those who had been raised on the bright and simple version. But others listened with a kind of relief they could not yet explain. They had sensed for years that the old version did not fit the shape of the pain they saw around them in the world. Ione gave them language for that unease, and so from one student to another, the newer understanding spread. This is how a legend moves from island to continent, not by marching, by echo. As the years passed, a strange thing happened. People began to use Medusa's name in conversations about injustice. Not always wisely, not always well. Some used it carelessly, as a symbol for anything frightening or female or difficult. But others used it with care, as a reminder that the world often turns its fear toward the vulnerable and then calls the result natural. That usage annoyed some scholars, but it also preserved her. It kept the wound visible. There were artists, too. One painted Medusa standing not in a cave, but by the shore at dawn, her gaze turned away from the viewer, her face half in shadow and half in light. Another sculpted Perseus not with sword raised, but with the shield lowered and his head bowed. A third wrote a play in which Athena is confronted by the memory of her own cruelty and cannot answer for it. These works divided audiences. Some called them blasphemous, others brave. All of them kept the story alive. And always, always, the reflection remained. People continued to say that on certain mornings, when the sea was very smooth, a woman's face could be seen in it. Some claimed it was the gaze of Medusa transformed into memory. Others thought it was only the human mind trying to find patterns in light. But for those who stood long enough, the experience was often the same. The reflection did not scare them. It saddened them. That, perhaps, was the truer miracle. A face in the sea that did not demand worship or obedience or panic. A face that asked only to be seen. Years later, Ione returned to Seriphos as an older woman. She had become respected for her writing and teaching, but she had never lost the habit of coming to the island when she needed clarity. This time she brought with her a young apprentice named Theon, a boy with too much confidence and not enough patience, which made him useful in the way the young often are. At the harbor, he complained about the heat, the boats, the smell, and the journey. Ione only smiled. When they reached the shoreline, Theon immediately asked, "So where is the famous reflection?" Ione looked at the sea. "If you chase it, you will not see it." He frowned but obeyed, more or less. They sat on a flat stone by the water and waited. The day was bright, and the surface of the sea shimmered with so much light that it seemed almost impossible for anything beneath it to appear. Theon was restless. He asked how long they must remain there, whether the tale was likely exaggerated, whether the islanders did not enjoy keeping visitors in suspense for their own amusement. Ione answered none of these questions directly. Instead, she said, "Stories do not reveal themselves to people who only want proof. They reveal themselves to people willing to be changed." Theon, who was not yet old enough to understand how much truth can hide inside a line like that, rolled his eyes a little. But he stayed. Near sunset, the water changed. The wind softened. The horizon grew pink and gold. The sea became still enough to hold the sky. Then for just a moment, something appeared. It was not a monster. It was not a threat. It was a face. Theon drew a sharp breath. Ione did not move. The face in the water was the face of a woman looking up through years, through story, through grief. Her hair seemed to move like dark threads in the current. Her eyes were sad but unafraid. Her expression was not one of vengeance. It was one of knowing. Theon whispered, "What is that?" Ione answered very softly, "What the world could not bear to keep as a person." When the reflection dissolved, Theon remained silent for a long time. At last he asked, in a different voice than before, "Was she truly a monster?" Ione looked at him. "What do you think?" He stared at the sea. "I think she was made into one. And Perseus? I think he was used. And the gods?" Theon hesitated. "I think they were powerful." Ione nodded. And was power the same as wisdom? No. Then you are learning. That evening they went back to the inn without speaking much more. But Theon did not complain again. He had seen something that unsettled his assumptions, and those are the beginnings of real education. Not the comfort of knowing, but the discomfort of rethinking. After many more years, when Ione herself was old, she wrote one final essay about Medusa. In it, she did not try to settle the question of whether the face in the water was a spirit, a memory, or simply an enduring story given form by expectation. She said that perhaps the important thing was not what the reflection was, but what it asked from those who saw it. It asked them to stop mistaking fear for truth. It asked them to remember that the world often names its victims as threats. It asked them to look again. That essay spread farther than any of her earlier work. Some admired it, some rejected it, but it was read. And because it was read, the story continued. In time, the myth of Medusa came to be told in schools, in theaters, in courtyards, in classrooms, in small houses by the sea. Each telling was a little different. Some emphasized her danger, some her suffering, some the failure of the gods, some the burden on Perseus. But all the better versions contained the reflection. All of them kept at least a trace of the woman beneath the legend. And so the final memory of Medusa was not a scream, nor a stone face, nor a trophy on a hero's belt. It was a reflection, a face in the water. A reminder that what we fear may be the very thing we have refused to understand. The sea keeps such things longer than people do. And so, even now, if the light is right and the wind is still, some say you can stand on a shore and see a woman looking back at you from beneath the ripples, not to frighten you, to ask whether you will finally tell her story honestly. The sea does not end a story. It only carries it. Long after the last singer of Seriphos had gone silent, long after Ione's essay had been copied and copied again until the ink had faded into new hands, the tale of Medusa continued to move. It traveled in fragments now, in different languages, across islands and inland roads, through children's rhymes and scholars' arguments, through stage plays, wall paintings, and the quiet voices of mothers who did not know they were teaching myth when they told their daughters to be careful with the world's easy judgments. The old version survived too. It always would. Some people still wanted a monster because the world seemed simpler with one. Some still wanted Perseus to stand only as a perfect hero because the comfort of certainty is a powerful thing. But the newer telling had taken root. It had entered the memory of the world, and once that happens, a story can never be made small again. What remained at the center of it was not the sword, not the head, not even the curse. What remained was the human cost. That was the truth Perseus had uncovered too late, and the truth Medusa had lived too early. In the centuries that followed, people would ask whether the story had a moral. They always ask that. They want a story to behave like a lamp in a dark room, to show them where to step and what to avoid. But the tale of Medusa resisted that kind of simple use. It offered no clean lesson. It offered something less comfortable and more necessary. The knowledge that power can distort justice, that fear can become a law, and that the person made into a symbol is often the first one erased by the symbol itself. That is why the story lasted, not because it was neat, because it was not. There came a time when the island of Seriphos changed hands so many times and changed customs so often that the names of most of its oldest heroes were nearly forgotten. The harbor was rebuilt. Houses rose and fell. A temple became a storehouse, then a ruin, then a place of gathering once more. The graves on the hill remained because the people who lived there had long since learned that graves are the stubborn memory of the earth. Even when kings vanish, even when languages shift, the dead remain in the care of the living. And so the graves of Danae and Perseus stayed. Children still climbed the hill with shells in their pockets. Fishermen still paused there before the season's first voyage. Travelers still came because they had heard that this was the island where the old hero had once chosen to speak differently about the monster he killed. They came seeking the place where the story had changed its own shape. Most found only wind, stone, and sea. But that was enough. For stories are not always kept alive by miracles. Sometimes they endure because enough people return to the place where a change happened and stand still there for a while. On the far side of the island, near the rocky cove where the old cave had once stood, time had softened the path. The cave itself, though still difficult to find, remained open to the sea and half hidden by wild plants. Visitors rarely came there now. Those who did often left quietly. Some said they felt a pressure in the air. Some said they heard the sea speak differently in that place. Some said nothing at all. The truth was simpler and more important. The cave had become a place where the world could no longer pretend innocence. There, the cave did not show a monster. It showed the cost of the oldest habit of power: to wound, then blame the wound for being ugly. People came to understand that in different ways. A scholar might write it in a long and careful sentence. A child might feel it as a shiver. A mother might recognize it in her own life and say nothing, only look longer at the sea. A poet might turn it into a line that lasts longer than the poet's own name. The forms changed. The meaning remained. This is what Medusa left behind. Not only fear, not only sorrow, a question. And questions are more enduring than monuments. In one later age, when the islands were ruled by people who had little love for old myths but much use for old symbols, a new statue was proposed for the harbor of Seriphos. The officials wanted a figure of Perseus, bright and heroic, to welcome ships in the style of all the familiar triumphs. The villagers agreed at first, because they had been trained by generations to honor visible greatness. But then the singers objected, the scholars objected, the women who tended the shrine objected. The fishermen objected too, though more quietly. They said that if a statue was to stand by the sea, it should not lie. So the island commissioned something different. They placed not a warrior, but a woman looking toward the horizon, her face neither smiling nor furious, her eyes steady and difficult to read. The hair was carved in flowing shapes that suggested both wind and seaweed, both danger and beauty. The pose was not threatening. It was alert. The plaque beneath it did not name her as monster or goddess. It said only, "To the one the world feared before it understood." Some officials found this unsatisfactory. Some visitors found it strange. But the people of Seriphos protected it. And over time, even those who disliked it had to admit that it caused people to think. They stopped in front of it. They argued about it. They asked questions. The statue worked in the oldest and truest way art can work. It made room for reflection. The islanders had learned finally that memory is not only about the dead. It is also about the living shape of what they were made to carry. As the years passed, the old shrine by the cliffs became a place where offerings were left not to ask for victory, but for clarity. People came when they felt trapped by other people's stories of them. They came when they were angry. They came when they had been accused wrongly. They came when they had hurt someone and could not undo it, only face it. The shrine no longer belonged only to Medusa, though her name remained at the center of it. It had become a place where consequences were admitted and where the truth, however uncomfortable, was honored. This was perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. A tale that began with a curse became a place of witness. The world has a rare need for such places. In the long view of history, the difference between a legend and a lesson is often who gets to speak at the end. In the earliest telling, it was the gods, then the heroes, then the poets. But in the later versions, it became the wounded, the doubters, the ones who were once called excess or error or threat. Their voices did not replace the old ones completely. They stood beside them. That was enough. A new harmony had entered the song. And because of that, Medusa did not remain merely a stone face or a warning whispered to children at night. She became an image of the question the world asks itself when it is finally tired enough to be honest. Who did we punish because we were afraid to challenge someone stronger? The answer was never simple. It never is. But once asked, it could not be unasked. Perseus's name too changed in the telling. Some retellings made him almost tragic from the beginning. Others made him wise only at the end. The best of the later ones allowed him to be ordinary in the most difficult way. A man born into power who slowly learned its costs. He was not made into a saint, because saints are too easy to admire and too hard to learn from. He was made into a witness. A man who did what he had been sent to do, and then spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that meant. That too mattered. For if Medusa represented the wound that power leaves behind, Perseus represented the person who must live after carrying out the deed power demanded. He had not been innocent. He had not been evil. He had been human inside a system of gods, and that is the condition most of us know best. He did not escape the truth. He only found it later than he should have. That is not heroism in the old sense. It may be something better. A humility that comes too late is still humility. The old fisherman told a saying in those later years, "The sea keeps what the land tries to forget." It was meant for many things, lost anchors, drowned letters, old names, but it fit the story of Medusa best. The sea had kept her image, her reflection, her silence, and the memory of her being seen at last not as a monster, but as a person. It had also kept Perseus's burden. It had kept Danae's endurance. It had kept the island's changing shame and changing wisdom. The sea is a difficult witness. It speaks in movement, not words, but it never lies by making things cleaner than they were. Perhaps that is why the last image of this story belongs to water, not to blood, not to bronze, not to the bright flash of a blade. Water. There is a final version of the tale, told now by the oldest singers, that ends not with death but with a shoreline at dusk. In this version, a child stands at the edge of the sea and sees, for a moment, a face in the reflection. The child is afraid at first, then curious, then quiet. The face does not rise. It does not attack. It simply looks back. The child asks whether it is a ghost. The singer says no. The child asks whether it is Medusa. The singer says perhaps. The child asks why the face appears. The singer answers, so that you remember to look twice before you decide what something is. This ending is gentle, but it is not soft in the careless sense. It carries the weight of everything that came before. It does not remove the cave, the curse, the death, the grief, or the long afterlife of the legend. It only gives the story its final mercy, a chance to be seen fully. That is what Medusa finally became in the best telling. Not a fixed symbol, a reminder. a warning to the powerful, a witness for the wounded, a face in the water that asks the world to slow down before it condemns. And that is how the story ends, though not how it disappears. For stories like this do not really end. They settle into the ground of memory and wait there, like seeds in winter, until the next person comes along with enough courage to tell the truth in a new way. The sea keeps moving, the island keeps its graves, the wind keeps passing over the cliffs, and somewhere just beneath the surface of the water, the reflection remains, not as an answer, as an invitation. Look again.